Now over to Robert and Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Thanks very much indeed. And welcome to all of you. So as Kathy says, this is going to be more of a conversation, I guess, than an interview. And we'll be talking around the themes of Stephen's new book on violence, hopefully in a reasonably non-violent way ourselves, although we'll see how the discussion pans out. We'll do that in a kind of format that allows Stephen to sort of set out his stall at the beginning for 5-10 minutes or so we can position the discussion. And then based on that, we'll have a fairly free-flowing dialogue, I hope, that will go organically where it needs to go, although there are certain kind of key themes we'll want to touch on in the middle of that. So that's the kind of process for this evening. I guess in terms of content, is he mad? Really, he seems to be arguing that the world is kind of getting better and there's less violence around us in general. Well, you look at any newspaper, go on any website, tune into the news anywhere, and it looks like civilization is going to hell in a handcart. It seems completely preposterous to suggest that the tendency, the trajectory of world history is towards peace and love, and he must have been taking the happy pills of some kind. So to defend this kind of preposterous thesis, I'm going to ask Stephen just to say a few words, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty about that. So Stephen, over to you.
Okay. If you get your impression about how much violence there is in the world from the news, you're going to be misinformed, because the news covers things that happen, doesn't cover things that don't happen. As long as rates of violence haven't declined to zero, and certainly no one would claim that they have, there's always enough of it to fill the evening news. And it's the job of the news to find violence that takes place anywhere on Earth and send the camera crew there. You never see a guy with a microphone on camera standing in front of an elderly man dying of Alzheimer's disease in a hospital bed. You never see a reporter in some city saying, well, it's the 37th year now that there has not been a war in this city. So forget the impression from the news. That just tells you that the rate of war has not gone down to zero. The only way you can assess how much war and peace there is to do a count. That is, count the number of wars by some definition, count the number of bodies. And when you do that, you see that the curve is bumpy, but unmistakably downward. We're living in an era that has fewer wars. Most dramatically of all, there have been 0 wars between Western European countries, between great powers, United States, Soviet Union, China, France, England. There have been no wars between wealthy developed countries since 1945. All of which I might have to even remind some of you that this is a notable statement, because we tend to think that wars are conflicts that take place in those poor, backward, remote parts of the world, and no one would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war. Well, the fact that that sounds banal is itself a dramatic historical change, because prior to 1945, of course, big, rich, powerful, and European countries were constantly at each other's throats. So there, the statistic of 0 is, you don't need fancy counts. You just look at the timeline of wars, and you see after 1945, in these categories, they fall off a cliff. Less obvious is that if you look worldwide, including Africa, Asia, Latin America, the number of wars and the number of deaths in war have been going down. This is a phenomenon that is well known to international relations scholars. A friend of mine, Joshua Goldstein, wrote a book called Winning the War on War that he was inspired to write because he is the author of the principal textbook in international relations. He's required to update the textbook every year, partly to stay one step ahead of the used book market, but also because the world does change. And in the book, he had an appendix of all the ongoing wars. And he noticed that with every edition of the book, the list got shorter and shorter. And then he realized that something very important is going on. But it's not just war. It's also personal violence. If one looks at statistics on homicide, which in a country like England go back 800 years, you see that the curve plummets, so that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestor. You can go even further back and even try to estimate, say from the archaeological record, how much violence there was before the dawn of writing in history. What percentage of skeletons from non-state societies before the rise of the state and large civilizations show signs of violent trauma, and they're shockingly high. Just one anecdote that captures these statistics. You all remember Ötzi the Iceman, the fantastically preserved 5,000-year-old mummy dug out of the Tyrolean Alps. Well, it turns out after putting him under an X-ray and examining every part of him, that he had an arrowhead embedded in his shoulder, and he was carrying a dagger that DNA analysis showed had the blood of 3 men on it. Well, this is, you don't want to generalize from one example, but it's not just an amazing fluke that the one guy that just happened to have been preserved in the ice also happens to have signs of violence. The statistics are high enough that that is by no means a spectacular fluke. Then finally, just think about some of the practices that used to be unexceptionable and which then vanished, like gory public executions. Samuel Pepys wrote of seeing a major general drawn and quartered, that is, cut open, his organs shown to him and burned and then strangled. And then he said the general looked as cheerful as a man could in that condition. He was a laughing matter, and then he continues, and then off to the pub for oysters with a friend. So for all our barbarism, we have gotten rid of gory public torture executions. We've gotten rid of other institutions such as human sacrifice, once practiced in every major civilization, chattel slavery with slave markets and legally enforceable slave contracts, debtors' prisons, in most Western countries, capital punishment across the board, the United States being an exception to that trend. The beating of children in schools by nuns and teachers, and the popularity of smacking and other forms of corporal punishment in the home have gone down. So in category after category, whenever violence can be quantified, it shows a downward trajectory. So that is the empirical phenomenon that is the centerpiece of the book. And then as a psychologist, I set myself the task of trying to explain, first of all, why violence is so ready to burst out at any time, and why, what aspects of human nature have we been able to mobilize to inhibit it more and more effectively over the centuries.
Okay, and just to be clear, and thank you for that, Stephen. It's a very helpful kind of positioning statement. Helps to orient us a bit. But it does sound like you are excluding non-physical violence, and of course, you know, I think about. I mean, my wife doesn't beat me anymore, thank God. But instead, she will, you know, violently assail me with her words, for example, and subject me to terrible rhetorical tortures. Now, why isn't she being violent? Why can't I accuse her of that?
Well, you can use the word violence for any practice you deplore, you know, economic violence and verbal violence, and this is a question that I get quite often, and I consider it a sign of progress that people are they're almost ready to concede. Okay, physical violence is down, but surely there's some kind of violence that's still out there. I personally think it is not helpful to lump together murder, rape, kidnapping, assault, war, genocide, torture, and so on with bitchy remarks, economic inequality, people getting on each other's nerves. And And I don't deny that that we still get on each other's nerves. We still insult each other, but it's qualitatively different and genuine progress compared to getting a bullet to the head, a knife between the ribs, being crucified, and so on.
Okay, well, as if crucifixion is just one of many forms of death.
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks for that. So that helps to kind of clarify the territory we're talking.
Yes, so I'm talking about physical violence, nothing metaphorical.
Okay, fine. So that's the territory we're on for this discussion.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things you said in those opening remarks, and just one of the many things you've touched on, because it's such a rich subject, was the notion of capital and corporal punishment. Because, and I guess why I was interested in this is that I have a kind of philosophical background. I did a lot of work on Jacques Derrida, and he talks about the violence of the law. There's an essay by him called The Force of Law. And he talks about, in a sense, what for shorthand we could call good violence. So this is when a state legitimizes itself to exercise violence in its own interests. So capital punishment would be an example of that. You mentioned in the United States, actually, the trend perhaps isn't going in the same direction as other countries. But nevertheless, it's an interesting idea that although we make the assumption that violence is a bad thing, there are practices of violence which we not only tolerate but even endorse. So if not necessarily capital punishment, punishment in general, so that the entire legal system, you could say, is based on a violence done to the individual, sometimes physically, in compensation for the violence, real or metaphorical, that they have done to others. So I wonder if you can help us with this a bit, the notion of what good violence might be as opposed to bad violence, or if that's a spurious distinction.
Yeah, I don't think I would say that there's any good violence, although there can be necessary violence, which simply means deterring still greater amounts of violence. So I think it's not just Derrida, it goes back to Max Weber defined the government as the institution that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Yeah. And of course, Thomas Hobbes gave a prescription to eliminate the violence of anarchy, namely you vest a Leviathan, a government, with legitimate use of violence. Yeah. And the Leviathan, as depicted on the cover of his book, had a sword. Yeah. And indeed, we have the police, and they will, if you do certain things, they will violently remove you and put you in jail.
Right. And for Hobbes, violence is one of the things which produces order.
Yes. Well, to the extent that it is needed to reduce greater amounts of violence. So yeah, if the police put you in handcuffs and drag you off to jail, that's a form of violence, but we probably all accept that it is better than having a lot of rapists and murderers and kidnappers on the streets. Yeah. Still better, of course, is the case where the norms are against violence, perhaps initially enforced by the muscle of the state, become internalized well enough that the state needs less and less violence, or needs only the threat of violence, rarely carried out, and people just behave themselves beforehand in anticipation of the violence they don't want to take place. So that would be successful deterrence. Likewise, the nations in dealing with one another have militaries for a similar reason. The threat of violence deters invasion. Yeah. But ideally, if everyone internalizes the norm that violence is futile, then you need smaller and smaller armies because your neighbors are less and less of a threat, and that can spiral downward because your neighbors are less worried if your stance is less bellicose. Yeah. And you can have a situation, say, like the Canada and the United States, or the member nations of the European Union, not coincidentally honored with the Nobel Prize just 3 days ago, yeah, where the armies have wound down, the forts facing each other on opposite sides of the border have been dismantled. It's not that the armies have been completely eliminated, but they're a shadow of their former selves because of this positive downward spiral.
Yeah. I like this notion of smaller violence to forestall greater violence. That's very helpful. On the Hobbes issue, though, I mean, what Hobbes says is that there is a kind of legitimate state violence that does perhaps prevent the larger violence that could happen. But his assumption underneath that is because, to use his famous phrase, the life of natural man is nasty, brutish, and short, and he expounds upon the idea that, in fact, our instincts are to be pretty violent with one another. So that's the kind of unruly energy that we have in us. You know, if you look at human beings in the raw state, their natural propensity is not towards peace, it's towards war. You know, that's where we begin. We begin polemically. We begin in a state of antagonism or aggression, which then needs to be tamed. So the civilizing process, and you talk about this in your book, is necessary because the default is the opposite. We are unpleasant creatures who need to be sorted out. So I wonder if it's easy to buy perhaps the expedient idea that you have a smaller amount of violence in order to preempt, preclude, forestall a larger amount of violence. Maybe harder to get rid of the presupposition, or at least the Hobbesian presupposition in that, which is, well, in all cases, that's because, given half the chance, we would stab each other.
Yes. I think Hobbes knew nothing about what life was like in a state of nature. I mean, he had a vague reference to uncivilized tribes in the Americas. Although I think he was dead wrong in his assumption that not only was life nasty, brutish, and short, but it was also solitary. He imagined that every man was at war against every man, and that's clearly wrong. But he did have, because people form families, clans, tribes, and they don't kill each other as much as they kill people in the other tribe. He was right, though, that in a state of anarchy, you do get rates of violence that we don't accept today, such as 15% of, on average, people being killed in warfare, about 1/2 of the population a year, which is even higher than the death rate at the height of World War II. And that's not atypical for a hunter-horticulturalist or hunter-gatherer society. Interestingly, Hobbes did not attribute this to some primordial thirst for blood or violent impulse. He had a more tragic notion that it is almost inevitable if you had agents that were intelligent, foresightful, and perhaps just a bit self-interested. Because the idea is, even if you didn't have an aggressive bone in your body, the people on the other side of the river, you're thinking, well, they have every reason to covet, my land, my livestock, my women. Maybe they're plotting a raid at this very moment. Now, I really don't want to get killed in my sleep. What are my options? Well, maybe I better do it to him before he does it to me.
Preemptive strike.
The preemptive strike. And the other guy is cranking through the same deduction. And he's saying, well, I don't really want to attack the other guy, but he has every reason to attack me. In fact, even if he doesn't want to attack me, he could be worrying that I'm going to attack him preemptively out of fear that he'll attack me. And so the tragedy is you could have two agents, two intelligent beings that really don't have a very strong aggressive urge, have enough self-interest that they could worry that the other guy, being like them, might be tempted to strike, and that could get the spiral going. And then you could have credible deterrence. If I'm strong enough that I could withstand a first strike and then retaliate, that's a way to protect myself through deterrence rather than preemption. But then you've got the problem that to prove the credibility of your retaliatory capability, you've got to respond violently to any insult or trespass to prove that it's not a bluff, that you're really going to carry through with the vengeance after the fact. And so you get these warrior honor cultures, of lashing out in violence to any trivial insult. So that's the way Hobbes conceived of this whole tragic cycle of violence, which he thought could be circumvented by having a disinterested authority.
Yeah.
Now, Hobbes's problem was, and the reason that I'm somewhat of a Hobbesian, but I don't buy the whole bill of goods, is that he didn't really give enough thought to the violence perpetrated by the Leviathan, because in practice, a government is not a disinterested wise king, but more human beings with all of their...
Well, it's ideological, apart from anything else.
Yes, and they have since the leaders are themselves going to be human beings with their own greed and their own biases, you got the problem of protecting the people against the Leviathan. The way I think of kind of the human dilemma is we're caught between the extremes of the violence of anarchy that Hobbes worried about and the violence of tyranny, which he didn't worry enough about. And you can think of democracy as a way of getting the benefits of each. Probably, if you look over the course of history, even though the violence of government can be enormously destructive, as we saw in the 20th century, probably on average the violence of anarchy is worse in terms of your chances of being killed, which is why so often countries, to our bewilderment, accept authoritarian governments that we would not, why a lot of people in China are actually perfectly happy with their government, or Russia, because they'd rather have a repressive government than the anarchy that they used to live through. So democracy is our way of muddling through and trying to get a government that exercises the smallest amount of violence necessary to prevent much greater violence.
Yeah. I mean, we're touching, there are two sides to this discussion. We're talking about the political side of it, but the other side of it is the kind of psychological side, I suppose. Yeah. And I couldn't help thinking of Freud as you were talking as well, because there's a real, in the way you described, the people on the other side of the riverbank, are they thinking what I'm thinking, and so on, suggests that the kind of field of violence is an external one, it's a social one. Whereas if you think of Freud, in a certain sense, he would argue, and indeed explicitly says in his later work, that the instinct for violence isn't just something that comes around in response to others. It's not just it's not a dialectical or dialogical or social function. It's much deeper than that. It actually structures the psyche in some way. So early on in Freud's career, he does talk about sadism, for example, and indeed sadomasochism. And for him, sadism, and you define sadism, I think, as the enjoyment of cruelty, or words like that. Mm-hmm. Freud talks about it in terms of the aggression instincts early on in his life. And later on, he goes on to say, well, it's actually so deep in us that it exists at a kind of species level. So when he talks about war, and he was writing in the wake of the First World War, and indeed the run-up to the Second World War, for him, the kind of violence that was manifested in such kind of global catastrophes was not due to these kind of almost ironically civilized negotiations that you're describing, where I'm thinking, is he going to get me first, or am I, and so on. It's to do with a much more mysterious, granted, much less empirical, granted, but much more powerful force, which says that actually there is something in the human being, in the species, which has a death wish. It is driven to destroy not only other people, but itself. And this was his most scandalous kind of remark, really, that there is the death drive in Freud is as much actually a suicidal drive as it is an instinct to do away with others. But in either case, it's something much bigger than any of us could contain, and much bigger than could be accounted for in sociological terms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in Better Angels, I do give Freud credit for really the core of his model of the psyche, namely the idea of a component of the mind that he called the ego, which uses some kind of mental energy, he had no idea what that was, to suppress the id, our evolved and frequently antisocial impulses and urges. I've long been skeptical of that theory until I did research for the book, and I found that there's a whole branch of psychology called ego depletion or ego control that actually conforms pretty well to Freud's idea that we have to repress our antisocial impulses with an effortful process. This is an idea that Norbert Elias helped himself to in his book, The Civilizing Process, which argued that that's what happened in the transition from the violent Middle Ages to the less violent present, is that the ego was strengthened. Or another way of putting it is people exercised more self-control, delay of gratification, shallower discounting of the future is the language an economist would use. So I think that, and indeed ingenious laboratory experiments have shown that it really might be an energy-consuming process. If people are sugar depleted, they have more trouble focusing, inhibiting their impulses, delaying gratification. The death wish, the theory of Thanatos that he derived after World War I find much more dubious. As you note, it is mystical. It's, I'm not sure that it makes sense to talk about a species-wide urge. I don't think that aggression is a kind of hydraulic urge or impulse that has to be discharged every once in a while. I think in the way that the longer we go without a drink, the thirstier we get. The longer we go without sleep, the more drowsy we get. I don't think it's true that the longer we go without killing someone, the more we want to kill someone. So I think it's not an analogy, even though I do think Freud was right that we do have certain impulses, like the desire for revenge, the desire for dominance, but these are triggered by situations. And so a better biological analogy might be to something like, say, shivering. Now, shivering is clearly an innate reflex, but if you're not cold, you don't shiver. You don't have a mounting urge to shiver because you haven't shivered for a few hours. And you can go the rest of your life without ever shivering again if you just never happen to be cold.
Yes.
And so violence might be like that. And I think this is testable, namely, if he's right that World War I in particular can be explained by this self-destructive, species-destructive urge, it's always going to be with us. And the reason that England and France versus Germany went to war is they were playing out this impulse. On the other hand, we have seen, and again I'll allude to the Nobel Peace Prize being given to the European Union, suddenly England and Germany just lost this desire to destroy the species by periodically going to war against each other. Hasn't happened since 1945.
Except in football, Steve.
Except in football, yes. But the species is doing just fine.
Yeah.
And it seems, you don't want to say that it's impossible, anything's possible, but I think in the realm of live options, England and Germany going to war is just one of the things that we just don't have to worry about. Yeah. This suggests that the Hobbesian analysis, that it is the mutual distrust, fear, tempting each side to preemptive attack, which is one of the ways in which World War I has been explained, is probably a better explanation than that the species has some urge to self-destruct, which, and I'll just mention one other thing, which on Darwinian grounds seems quite unlikely.
So this is one of the fault lines, perhaps, this idea of whether violence is externally generated, and therefore if you can control the conditions, as it were, you reduce the urge for violence, or whether indeed that urge is internal in some way and beyond the reach of control through social conditioning and so on. There's so we buy that, say, we come down on your side of the argument, and we say, all right, fine, but my God, look at the world population growth. It's fine at the moment in reasonably affluent societies, perhaps. Less affluent societies tend to be generally a bit more violent, generally speaking. What about by the time the world population has tripled, and there are so many of us, that all those pacifying instincts that have come about through the civilizing process become just practically impossible because there are too many other people competing for fewer resources, and I just have to start killing other people to get my own way.
Yeah.
So really, what I'm getting, this is really a question of what the end game is that you're getting at in your book and in your thinking, because do we end up in heaven on your thesis? Because everything seems to be getting an awfully lot better, or is there a plateau we can anticipate? Is there a reversal we might fear or we can plan for? And so on. So I want to ask you first of all about this notion of the end point, because the end point does seem implicit in some of the assumptions, I guess. And then I want to talk specifically about the notion of progress. But this notion of an end point, can we just look forward to nirvana?
Yeah, no. No, I think I don't think there's anything mystical about the historical decline of violence. And for some categories of violence, it certainly won't go to zero. I believe in human nature. I believe that human nature is part of our, comes from our biological endowment, gets perpetuated to our children and our children's children. And there's always going to be some young hothead who loses his temper in a bar in a fight over a pool table and pulls out a knife. There's always going to be some lady who puts arsenic in her husband's tea. I don't think that can be brought to zero. I think I would not predict that terrorism is going to go to zero, because all it takes is, in a world of 7 billion people, who's to say there isn't going to be some guy somewhere who doesn't want to get on the evening news by making a bomb out of drugstore ingredients.
So there'll always be a kind of residuum.
I think there'll always be, yes, I think there'll always be a residuum. I think, though, that certain rates can be brought down lower to what they are now. Really what I'm talking about in most of these categories is not progress towards heaven, nirvana, utopia, and so on, but just chipping away at the numbers. So, which I consider progress. If the murder rate is half of what it used to be, that's great. And let's see if we can make it half of that, and perhaps even half of that, and it might asymptote at some level above zero. That might be the price we pay for not living in a totalitarian society with Big Brother watching you around the clock. You tolerate some degree of violence. There are, though, some categories of violence that could be brought to zero, because stranger things have happened. So take cultural practices like human sacrifice, where, again, every ancient civilization practiced it, some in staggering quantities, hundreds of thousands, even millions of victims that were slaughtered to appease an angry god. Maybe if we slake his thirst for blood with a sacrificial victim, then he won't do it to us. Better him than me. Then civilization after civilization thought the better of human sacrifice. Maybe they realized that the bloodthirsty god hypothesis was factually incorrect. Maybe life got too valuable. They got more squeamish about cutting the beating heart out of a living person. And, whatever reason, they abolished it, and it stayed abolished. There are no societies now that practice human sacrifice.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's no examples of kind of reversals. I mean, once you reach a certain level of pacification, the trend never goes backwards.
In some categories.
Right.
So another example is slavery as a legal institution. Now there continues to be human trafficking and various shadow forms that shade into slavery, but slavery as an institution that is practiced in the open, that affects a large percentage of the population, that can be enforced by the government, that got abolished by the last country that had permitted it in 1980, Mauritania. It was, and before that, 1962, Saudi Arabia and Yemen eliminated it. But it was a process where the bulk of the abolitions happened in the 19th century, and it's more or less state abolished. France had to abolish it twice because Napoleon reinstituted it. But by and large, once you abolish it, it stays abolished. And there are other things, atmospheric nuclear testing. That's probably not going to come back, because even the rogue states detonate their bombs underground. Commercial whaling. There are certain practices where if they are an institution, and if there's some finite number of players, then it's not utopian to just zero them out. It's not inconceivable that war between countries could fall into that category. And there are a number of political scientists who have claimed that interstate war is obsolescent. There are certainly fewer and fewer of them. It's become pretty close to unthinkable in advanced countries dealing with each other. And it is not crazy to think that with only 200 countries, there could be an evolving norm that we just don't do that anymore. Now, there could still be civil wars, but interstate war could, at least conceivably, could go to zero. Homicide, no. Terrorism, no. I don't think child abuse and domestic violence will go to zero, but it would be progress if it was less than what it is now.
So as you're talking, it reminds me a little bit of, and I'm putting on my skeptic's hat for a moment, Francis Fukuyama's work on kind of the ends of history. It was, and he was, as you know, pretty harshly criticized because Fukuyama, and I'm collapsing the argument very quickly here, but he briefly said, look, the tendency of all political ideologies is to become liberal democracies, and those countries which aren't are just sort of lagging behind, and eventually they will, and the whole world will be a liberal democracy, and it will all be fine. And subsequently 9/11 happened and other things, so it's much more difficult for him to make those claims. So there's again, with my skeptical hat on, I'm sort of thinking, well, okay, maybe it's not utopian because you grant that there will always be random instances of violence, but the general tendency is downwards, and the implication being we'll live better lives. Fine. But underneath that, there's, again, in philosophical terms, if you like, there's a kind of Hegelian prejudice. Hegel is the philosopher most associated, I suppose, with the notion that history does move on a kind of line of progress. You talked about progress, that there is a kind of left to right, or however you perceive it, past to future, along which not just time travels, but history itself. So history itself takes a forward momentum, and generally, in Hegelian terms, a forward momentum from something worse to something better, from a less good to a more good. And there's plenty of critiques of this notion. For a start, that helps because it helps us to understand history, but it's not the case, And so a very severe critic might say, well, you've marshalled all these facts, but you've marshalled them because you have a prejudice about the notion of history moving in a progressive way from A to B. Other versions of that say, no, history doesn't move along these sort of ineluctable grid lines, but it's interrupted, or it moves in circles, or it repeats. So the famous phrase, history repeats itself as tragedy or farce, and so on. But the underlying preconception there is that there is a sort of, and I'll use the word again, almost mystical notion that history somehow magically, ineluctably unfurls. And yes, there may be facts we can corral in order to support that, but there's still a prejudice we're dealing with. Now, that's a Hegelian view. As it happened, Marx took that view over as well, and he said, in his own terms, that communism will eventually happen. It's inevitable that communism will happen. It's historically inevitable. And there are people on left and right debating that at the moment, as you know. But again, it's something I think we need to just go around a little bit. One of the deepest assumptions here, which is about that there is progress, as opposed to a completely different concept of time and history, that it stops and starts, that it repeats, that it goes in circles, and so on.
Yeah. So nothing could be further from the way I see these developments. So there are two questions. One of them is what has happened from past periods to now, and what's going to happen in the future. So what has happened up till now, that's not a matter of prejudice. That's a matter of plotting the data on a graph and just looking whether the line goes like that, or the line goes like that, or the line goes like that, with cycles. And I make the case that prejudice, ideology, theory aside, look at the data, that's just the way it's gone. Now there's the question of how do we interpret it? Why has it gone down, and will it continue? There, of course, once you're predicting an uncertain future, that's where theory inevitably comes in, because you can interpret the same data in multiple ways. But again, I think there are more and less reasonable ways of interpreting the data. I think the idea that there are cycles and that I've just happened to catch humanity at the trough of a sinusoid is not supported by the data. There's just history is not cyclical. The wars don't have cycles. There's a lot of randomness, which can fool you into thinking that there are cycles, but it's not as if we're due for another span of war because it's that time in the grand cycle that the cycles don't exist.
But the randomness means that, in principle, we could have a third world war.
We could, and we could have a third world war.
Right.
Yeah. I think the randomness can coexist with changing probability. And the way I would put it is, it is still possible, but it's less likely than it used to be. Now, why have we seen a decline? Is there some directionality to history? Will it inevitably continue? I don't think so. I think it's just that nonviolence really is a better state of affairs than violence. Violence is wasteful. You might think, well, yeah, but if you're the perpetrator, isn't violence good for you, you get what you want. Well, yeah, but you're not going to be the perpetrator forever. Winners become losers. If you have to convince other people how they ought to live their life, you can't say, well, we'll do it in a way that benefits me and not you. So in the long run, everyone's better off if there's less violence. And so we figure out ways of knocking violence down. And we accumulate our knowledge. We learn lessons of history, imperfectly, not always. To the extent we do, we make things better. So the way I would analogize it is, would you expect, and this is a different way of coming to a conclusion that sounds a little bit like Fukuyama, but I think invokes a different mechanism. So would you expect that more and more of the world will have access to antibiotics or cell phones? And I think the answer is yes. More and more of the world is going to have cell phones. Not because there's any mystical process that says that the end of history is that everyone has a cell phone, but rather cell phones are good things to have. If you have people who like to communicate, cell phones are a really good way of doing it. If you have people who get sick, antibiotics are a good thing to have. Ergo, more and more people are going to want them. If we can make more antibiotics, then everyone will have access to them. So likewise, peace is a good thing. It's really better than war over the long run. And if we apply our ingenuity to figuring out ways of making wars less likely, we're going to keep the things that work, and the world gradually, bumpily, with local reversals, will, on average, try to keep those developments. So it's just another kind of technological progress, and it's undeniable that technological progress has taken place.
So, okay, we're in a situation where things will probably get better, and that's the tendency. So, relax.
Well, no, it's no more than you constantly have to maintain your house. You constantly have to maintain the health of your body.
Yeah.
Here I'm with Freud and others with a tragic view that the potentiality is always within us. We need institutions like governments, like the United Nations, like peacekeeping forces, like education, literacy, institutions of communication and travel, so that we don't backslide into a tribal way of life. So far from relaxing, it's let's really try to figure out what works and what doesn't, so that we don't waste our time on measures designed that seem like on paper that they should reduce violence that don't work, and we ignore other things that our best science tell us seem to work.
Yeah, okay. In a few minutes I'm going to bring in the audience and we'll hear some other voices.
One other thing we could, I don't know if you want to pick up the thread of another question that you asked first, and that's about population, resources, and so on.
Yes, I want to come to that. And I guess the final question I want to come round to is, I guess it's one about the agenda. I mean, it sounds a bit Machiavellian to ask you what's your agenda. That's not. I don't quite want to put it like that, but I'd be quite interesting to get at the intent behind the book, and behind the project, if you like, and within that, what some of the kind of political choices are, because you can have a very peaceful society that's also extremely unequal, for example. So I want to come on to that, but yes, let's have a go around the population question.
Yes, I think population itself is a red herring.
Yeah.
When I was a child, I memorized the population of the world, which was 3 billion. Now it's 7 billion. You might think, oh my God, how could, you could have thought back then in the early 60s, how could our planet possibly feed another 4 billion people, more than the number that it already has? And there's, of course, plenty of starvation in the early 60s, in India, in China, in Africa. And here we are in a world that's more than doubled its population, and there is less hunger than there was back in the early 60s. And less war.
But what about then all the forecasts for resources becoming squeezed and so on?
So so first of all, crowding per se is not a risk factor for human violence. Some of the most densely populated parts of the world are some of the most peaceful. Hong Kong, Tokyo, Amsterdam, and some of the most sparsely populated are some of the most violent, like Sudan. Democratic Republic of the Congo is not particularly crowded in terms of people, but it's got plenty of violence. And by the way, Democratic Republic of the Congo also has plenty of resources, and Hong Kong has none. So the idea that that violence comes from scarcity of resources, I think is deeply wrong. Especially, it may have been truer in the past than it is now, because wealth and prosperity less and less come from just having a certain amount of stuff, and more come from how you combine it with other stuff by intelligent recipes, designs, formulas across large networks of cooperation and trade. In terms of projections in the future, first is the question of whether there really will be resource shortages, and there might be over water. Most predictions of resources running out have turned out to be wrong, and they may still continue to be wrong. There's new discoveries of fossil fuels.
But you're not, just to be clear, you're not suggesting a kind of infinite growth of the human species and infinite resources to sustain it. That we must assume some sort of limit.
The limits are probably different than what we think. So I think that
Different
very
and
few of the
larger.
limits, I think the limits are going to be political rather than amount of matter and energy. That is, if we have arrangements that continue, that don't develop the technology at a requisite pace, and that moreover don't provide the kind of incentives that prevent people from squandering the resources that we have, then things could get much worse, there's no doubt. More to the point, but I'm not an expert on resources. What I want to talk about is violence. And the assumption, which I'd like to challenge, is that wars are caused by resource shortages, and that if there are more resource shortages, there will be more wars. Now, there can be a lot of human suffering and misery and waste, so we absolutely should be concerned with shortages of water and arable land, with climate change, just because it would be really bad if people got poorer and if people starved and disease increased. But among those catastrophes, organized armed conflict is not necessarily one of them. And in fact, not only are most wars not fought over resources in any obvious way. I mean, the Arab-Israeli conflict is not about resources. World War II wasn't obviously about resources. World War I.
They were both about land in some sense.
Land because of its symbolic value, not because it was needed for planting crops. Jerusalem is not a particularly fertile place, and there's a lot of violence over it because of the meaning that people invest in it, not because of physical resources. And indeed, studies that try to correlate the climate stress or resource shortages at time 1 with civil war at time 2 find not much correlation. It's often the rich, flush tribes and countries that raid each other, that have the luxury of planning for war. The dirt poor ones suffer, but they don't necessarily go after each other's in raids and organized wars. So this is, again, just to make it clear, this is not a call for complacency about climate change or resources. There are lots of reasons that this is a very, very high priority, but you don't have to add war on top of what is already an extremely serious set of challenges I think, to make it imperative to deal with those challenges.
Okay. So just to sort of begin to close this part of the discussion before we open it up, I guess the question, as I said, the word agenda isn't right, but it's something about what your intent is with this, what the message is, what you want people to do differently as a result of listening to you, reading your work, hearing about your project. Is it do you have a political agenda? Is it, go away and make sure we have more civilizing institutions, work harder for, the UN? I mean, what's the sort of, what's the call, if there is a call?
Yeah. Well, the overall call is to treat violence as an empirical problem that we try to document and understand the causes of. So whatever the answer turns out to be, I'm in favor of that. Now, it seems to me that and that is not as banal as it sounds, because there's a lot of moralizing about violence. There are a lot of intuitions, assumptions, dogmas about violence, and probably not enough analysis of the facts of violence, because it's so easy to moralize. one of the founders of the quantitative study of war, Lewis Richardson, had a wonderful quote that he said, "I can be accused of saying to understand all is to forgive all, and what I reply is to condemn much is to understand little." So understanding would be the top priority. Based on at least my best assessment of the evidence so far, and this is again assuming that violence is that killing and raping and assaulting are all bad things that ought to be minimized. There are some lessons. I think good government is a really good thing, that anarchy is a bad thing, as are tyrannical, non-democratic governments. I think that commerce, trade, exchange are good things, that it's good to knit people together in webs of economic dependency. And again, not to keep beating this horse, but the assignment of the Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union not only recognized the value of an international community, but the European Union grew out of the European Common Market, which grew out of the European Coal and Steel Union, which were explicitly designed to implement the theory that trade reduces war. If you have two countries that economically depend on each other, then attacking the other is like attacking itself, and it is not even tempting because you could buy stuff more cheaply than you can plunder it, and the other guy's more valuable to you alive than dead. So I think I applaud the Nobel Committee, even though they obviously were trying to make a political point given the currency union and all kinds of extra stuff, but they were really right in saying that what was started off as an economic union really did have a pacifying force. A third is education. I cite a number of studies that suggest that countries that are better educated are less likely to slip into dictatorship and civil war. And cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, make it harder to demonize and dehumanize other tribes that you otherwise would not be familiar with. So these would all be my best guess as to some of the pacifying forces. I'd add one more. We didn't have time to touch on it, but I'll just throw it out there because I do argue for it in the book, and that is empowerment of women. That seems to have many beneficial effects, among them lowering rates of violence.
And particularly struck by your first point there about understanding. And just to go back to where we started to round this off, you know, I started this parody of what the newspapers say, you know, about violence and so on. And I guess, am I right in thinking implicit in what you're saying is the lack of understanding of violence, where it comes from, the trend and so on, itself is potentially dangerous because it produces a fear of violence that itself can create the acts of violence which were deplored in the first place and so on. Is that there's a kind of strange reverse psychology that happens because of that?
There can be. So for example, I'll give you an example. The panic about terrorism, that after 9/11 there's going to be planes are going to be shot out of the sky and stadiums are going to be blown up. Nuclear terrorism was imminent. I mean, that was quite obviously responsible for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the abuses of torture and rendition and so on. And people were willing to let the governments do that because it seemed like a reasonable response to these catastrophic threats. If the threats were actually not so big to begin with, then the reaction to the threats might not have been as big. That having been said, I've got to give an important shout out to the role of the press and journalism in, I think, helping along the decline of violence by making clear to people the human costs of war, something that it was very easy to gloss over when press photography was banned from the battlefield. And so you could nurture an idea that war is heroic and manly and thrilling and spiritual and all of these things that people used to believe. That didn't survive intense press coverage of actual battlefield carnage. So there's another paradox, which is we overreact, we overestimate the amount of violence, we're more sensitive to it. That does tend to be one of the forces that makes us more motivated to root it out, too. That we think we tolerate less violence than our ancestors did, and so we're more vigilant about trying to extirpate what remains.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. We'll go into questions. We've got some roving microphones, and I'm sure hands will go up faster than I can spot them. And if I fail to identify this on a first come, first served basis, I'm sorry, but I will do my best. I think the first one I saw was way over on the left-hand side.
Thank you very much for the very eloquent conversation. My question was, what do you think the history of violence would have been like in a matriarchal society? Burning with this question the whole way through until right at the end you talked about how important the empowerment of women could be in future prevention. But I think looking back, it would be very interesting to think about the impact matriarchal society may have had.
Thank you. So, wonderful question. What would the history of violence have looked like under matriarchal societies?
Yeah. So if women are in charge, there'd be less violence. There wouldn't be zero violence, but there'd be less. I think in the book I try to distinguish different motives for violence, because I don't think there's any one such thing as an aggressive instinct. Some violence is just a kind of rational self-interest. You eliminate or harm something that happens to be a obstacle on the path to something that you want. And I don't think there's that much reason to think that that differs between men and women. If there were a chicken talking about the history of violence, they'd say maybe we're as violent as ever, and I don't think that there's any aggressive impulse that we have against chickens. We just like the way they taste, and we turn off our empathy. So I think that category probably doesn't differ as much, although women probably do have more empathy than men, so I should qualify even that. But the category that really drives the rates up is dominance and revenge. The macho posturing, the violent retaliation against insults, the thirst for grandeur, preeminence, prestige, status, dominance, hegemony, for its own sake, is more of a guy thing than a female thing. And so both cross-culturally in the anthropological record and historically in the recent historical record, societies in which women have more power tend to go to war less.
I'm just wondering if there's any brave soul who'd like to argue the reverse.
Lady Macbeth.
Lady Macbeth, there
Yes.
you go.
Well,
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to get to all the hands, but the gentleman with the glasses and the white hair with the jumper, thank you.
Professor Pinker, you quoted quite rightly how the murder rate has fallen massively since the Middle Ages. When I believe I've seen some numbers show that Britain was a more violent country than Colombia is today. But it's double what it was 50 years ago, and it may arguably be double in terms of murder rates than it was 100 years ago. Why do you think that is, and how does that fit your thesis?
Yeah. So there has been, if you look at the trajectory of homicide in most Western countries, you have the massive decline since the Middle Ages, and then the 1960s happened, and there was a bit of an uptick. The uptick, by the way, has been in large part reversed again. Most dramatically in the United States, where the homicide rate more than doubled during the 1960s, and then in the 1990s it fell back to earth, and it's continuing to droop year by year. In Britain, it took a little longer. It was only in the 2000s that the homicide rate started to fall again after the great disruption of the 1960s. So this was a partial reversal, only in part. We're talking about, so in the say in the Middle Ages, the homicide rate, as you note, was similar to what you see in Colombia today, anywhere from 35 to 70 homicides per 100,000 per year. That fell by the 1900 in most Western European countries, or at least in Britain, to about between 1 and 2 per 100,000 per year. It then went up to, say, between 3 and 4. So we're still talking about way, way lower. And then it's the reversal has been in turn reversed. I think it's because many of the historical changes that brought violence down from the Middle Ages to the present, to the 60s, then got reversed by the 60s. And as a baby boomer, it pains me to say this, that our parents were kind of right, that if you have a society that defies authority, that valorizes individualism and demonizes conformity, that allows or encourages young men to, rather than moving to the suburbs and raising a family, to hang out with other men. If you've got a criminal justice system that voluntarily disarms and stops going after criminals and hooligans and vandals, then the violence rate goes back up. And part of the reversal of the reversal, namely it starting to come back down to earth, is because communities and police got more serious about dealing with violence. Again, partly this was an interesting reversal that was partly fueled by the feminist movement. When up through the 70s, it was kind of square and unhip to be against crime. It was kind of self-expression, it was rebellion, it was advancing the revolution. So there's all kinds of revolutionary romantic nonsense about violence that I think as it trickled, as it affected the actual practice of the criminal justice system, it allowed a relaxing of standards which let the crime rate go up. Well then, a number of feminist theorists in the 70s started to concentrate on rape and domestic violence, and then all of a sudden violence was a bad thing again, because it was obviously harming so many women. And the feminist movement pushed for a strong emphasis of the criminal justice system on violent perpetrators, on safe streets. And then people realized, hey, this is a pretty good idea. That idea in the 60s that violence was just part of the revolutionary spirit was kind of goofy, and that clamping down on violence will protect women against rape, and it'll also make us all safer, and that reversal is still in motion. And it came a little later in Britain than it did in other Western democracies, but it is definitely visible in the statistics.
Thank you. Because of the volume of questions, I'm going to take two, if that's all right, and ask you to deal with two together, if that's okay.
I think, can we do them one at a time? But
You
maybe you
prefer
remember
that?
the two? Yeah.
Okay.
We have some very vehement
There's one over-
hands on the left, so
Okay.
I'm going to...
There's one here.
Yes, but after...
My question.
Okay, fine.
From hunter-gatherer times to now, there's been this obvious downward trend in violence, but there's also been an upward trend in ability to kill people, culminating in sort of nuclear capability, which kind of coincides with the massive drop-off at the end of the Second World War. So just the fact that we now have the ability to kill lots of people at the same time without very much effort. And how do you feel that relates to your theories about does it make society less violent, the fact that it's easier to be very successfully violent should you want to be?
Yeah. Well, there are two ways in which, this is a frequently asked question, and it comes in two flavors. One of them is, should we thank the nuclear bomb for giving us the long peace since 1945? That is, countries were just so terrified by the possibility of nuclear escalation that they didn't go close to waging a war. In one version is, should the nuclear bomb be given the Nobel Peace Prize? There are people who make that argument. I'm skeptical of it for a number of reasons. One of them being that countries without nukes also thought the better of waging war. Another is that the Second World War showed that you could do so much damage with good old-fashioned bombs and tanks and bombers and artillery that there already was mutually assured destruction, even with conventional warfare, and no one wanted a rematch of World War II anytime soon. And also because nuclear weapons are so disproportionately destructive compared to any strategic military aim, it's almost as if they were taken off the battlefield as a live option and had very little effect on the waging of war. So just to take one of many examples, why did Argentina do something as stupid as to invade the Falkland Islands, knowing that Britain was a nuclear power? Answer, they knew that Britain was not going to reduce Buenos Aires to a radioactive crater in response. So the nuclear threat is so ridiculously disproportionate that it's almost a bluff. Everyone knows that no one is really going to use it. And I think that's why you have so many non-nuclear states defying nuclear ones. And it's why that it wasn't just amazing luck that no nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. There's really no, other than to deter an all-out invasion, an existential threat, there's absolutely no reason to have nuclear weapons. And it's even possible, and I'm saying this as someone who is not romantic or utopian, it's not inconceivable that they could be abolished within the lifetimes of some of the people in this room, the younger people. The other way of asking the question is more of a challenge that aren't we living in more violent times by definition, as long as we have the capability of wreaking massive destruction? And so we could be living in peace forever, but we could do it, and that by definition makes us violent. And that's kind of for me, that's more of a philosophical question of what you mean by violence. If the nuclear weapons just kind of rust away until they're radioactive junk metal and are never used, that's peaceful enough.
So let me come back to the gentleman over here.
Okay. You said about the German, French, and the Second World War and the First World War, and their psychology of perhaps being self-destructive. In the current war between Israel and Iran, and the fact that Israel lost 6 or 7 million in the Second World War, do you think that their psychology and sort of paranoia and the Arab psychology will lead them to have to do what you said, that we will no longer be able to fight Germany, England and Germany will no longer fight, or at least not for the foreseeable future? Are they, therefore, Israel and the Arabs, heading for one of those great big bumps that you mentioned in the graph, in your opinion?
Almost certainly not. So the wars between Israel and its neighbors, Israel, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, there hasn't been one since 1973, through several regime changes in Egypt. And those were the wars, by the way, that by far killed the most people. Certainly the War of Independence, the 1973 war. If you look at the number of casualties in the Arab-Israeli conflict, it goes down like that. And again, this is because the wars between countries are the ones that do the most damage, that kill the most people. And I don't see those wars as starting up anytime soon. If there's the two worrisome scenarios, one of them, the one that Israel itself worries about, is Iran gets the bomb, they hasten the coming of the 12th Imam, or they rectify the ancient injustice of the existence of State of Israel by dropping a nuclear bomb on Tel Aviv, causing a second Holocaust, destroying the State of Israel, and that would be one outcome that is motivating the fear of Israel to strike preemptively. The other is that Israel does strike preemptively, and that Iran then unleashes a wave of terrorism in response. I think it's unlikely that they would try to invade Israel for a number of reasons. So those are the, and I don't think the first scenario is extremely unlikely. That although it's be better for everyone if Iran doesn't get a bomb, I don't think that they are planning to perpetrate a second Holocaust. I don't think that's part of their game plan, if for no other reason. And here's where nuclear deterrence might have an impact. Namely, as I mentioned, its only use is to deter an out-and-out invasion and existential threat. Since Israel does have a nuclear capability and they presumably would use it in retaliation, that would prevent Iran from hastening the coming of the 12th Imam by that route, or whatever disaster scenario you have. I don't think anyone really knows how many deaths would come from an Israeli or an American preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. But quite likely it would be less than the death toll from the interstate wars between Israel and Egypt in its history.
Even if they hit one of the nuclear sites and they spread all the nuclear fallout, I mean, surely the paranoia of Israel having lost the 6 million, wouldn't that affect, and America behind them, wouldn't that psychology affect the possibility of a preemptive strike? And if they hit those nuclear sites, surely the fallout from the nuclear waste would be enormous, wouldn't it?
Well, we need an expert in nuclear science to tell us, but I don't think so. It's not like it would trigger a nuclear explosion, and it probably would not be as, I don't know if it would be like another Chernobyl or Fukushima, because there isn't as much material, and it's more more deeply buried. But again, I'm not going. That I don't know.
That's a sort of speculation beyond certainly my competence.
And mine as well.
All right. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry to say this. We've only got time for one more question, but Stephen will be around to sign books and discuss afterwards. The gentleman at the very back. Yes, you, sir.
Just very quickly, did you find any interesting and useful correlations between education or types of education and violence?
Yes, there are a number of such correlations. So people and average levels in societies that are higher on educational attainment or intelligence or both, and they tend to be correlated, are less likely to commit violent crimes. They're less likely to be victims of violent crimes. Society-wide, they're more likely to be receptive to democracy 10 years down the line. They're less likely to have civil wars. So yes, there are a number of positive knock-on effects to high levels of education. And also periods in history in which levels of literacy and availability of books and printed material have gone up have often preceded Enlightenment, such as the European Enlightenment, which occurred prior to a huge explosion in intensity of printed discourse, the Republic of Letters, as it's sometimes called.
So, Stephen, in a moment I'll hand back to Kathy to close this event before the book signing. But I wanted to give you an opportunity, in case there's anything else you wanted to add or a message you wanted to leave us with to round things off.
Well, again, I guess I would, if I had to give one summary statement, it would be to reiterate at least what I like to think is what motivates me in writing this book, and that is to attend to the empirical record on what causes war and homicide, terrorism, genocide, domestic violence, and so on, and to attend to the best data we have on what reduces it. It's just so easy to moralize, catastrophize, sermonize. Ultimately, what we want to do is have fewer and fewer victims of violence, fewer rape victims, fewer genocides, fewer wars, fewer homicides, less domestic violence. And so it's not a question of having your favorite ideology vindicated. It's a matter of looking to the factual record and seeing what works and doing more of it.
Please join me in thanking Stephen and Robert.